Victor Drake stepped onto the landing platform of Omega-12. The air smelled of ozone and processed oxygen. He carried one exile pack and a standard-issue translator. Earth's government had purged thousands like him. Brilliant engineers, strategists, economists. They labeled them unstable, dangerous, too visionary for the rigid system, so they scattered them. Left them on fringe worlds with minimal supplies and zero support. They thought they were disposing of problems. They didn't realize they were seeding the outer systems with their finest minds. Exile wasn't an end. It was a brutal kind of selection. Drake's eyes scanned the chaotic market around him. He didn't look like a man who'd lost everything. He looked like a commander surveying a new battlefield. His first move was observation. He stood motionless for 17 minutes, absorbing the flow of the bazaar. He watched who traded what, which stalls had the shortest lines, where the security patrols lingered and where they never went. He wasn't seeing a market. He was reading a tactical map of influence and vulnerability. Then he moved. He didn't haggle. He didn't show desperation. He acquired a hardened data slate, a signal interceptor, and a packet of high-capacity power cells. Each purchase was precise, deliberate. He bypassed the flashy weapons dealers and went straight for the information tools. The Exile Pack's currency was low, but he spent it like a general allocating his last elite squad. The standard-issue translator in his hand wasn't just for language. He modified it within the first hour, patching into local public networks. It became his ears, his first intelligence asset. The pack's contents, meant for basic survival, were repurposed. A thermal blanket became a signal-dampening cloak. Ration packs were traded for encrypted comms time. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate survivor. This was a strategist, a man who understood that information is the first and final weapon. He was positioning pieces on a board only he could see. He turned every limitation into an advantage, every weakness into a form of leverage. The systems that cast him out operated on force and public control. Drake was building something different, something that moved in the spaces they weren't watching. He was already laying the groundwork for control, not through occupation but through understanding. Survival was the immediate objective, but it was only phase one. The real operation was just beginning. Drake didn't build an army. He assembled a collection of specialists who preferred working in the dark. Their talents existed in the gaps of conventional systems, places most authorities didn't even know needed monitoring. The criminal networks operating in Omega-12's underbelly initially viewed him as just another rival, looking to carve out territory. They prepared for a turf war. What they got was something far more dangerous. Zara Plex arrived first. She was a quantum systems theorist whose research had been deemed too disruptive for Earth's controlled tech markets. She could manipulate data at the subatomic level, rewriting security protocols from the ground up. Then came Corval, a former infrastructure analyst who understood the physical weaknesses in planetary networks. He knew which conduits to tap and which firewalls had architectural flaws. The Cynthian twins completed the core team, operating with a synchronized mental link that allowed them to process vast data streams in real time, spotting patterns no individual could perceive. These weren't mercenaries for hire. Drake approached each of them not with offers of payment but with proposals of purpose. He identified what the system had taken from them, what grievances they held, and then presented a clear alternative. He showed them how their specific skills could build something new rather than just tear down the old. He spoke of architecture instead of anarchy. Their loyalty wasn't purchased with credits. It was secured through a shared understanding of what they could achieve together. They became his phantom crew, operating completely outside the established power structures. They didn't use standard channels or leave conventional traces. Their operations were surgical, precise, and left no debris. They moved through information networks like ghosts, influencing events without ever being present. Drake had turned the system's cast-offs into its most effective instrument of change. They became his means of manipulation, a tool designed not for destruction but for careful, systemic adjustment. Their first assignment would test this unconventional approach. It wasn't about seizing control through force. It was about demonstrating that the most secure places were only secure until someone understood them better than their creators did. The crew was ready. Their methods were untested in the field, but their understanding of the underlying systems was absolute. They were about to execute an operation that would make traditional espionage look clumsy and obvious. The hegemony relay station was considered impenetrable. It was the central communications hub for 3 sectors, a fortress of data flowing between military commands and government centers. Its security protocols were legendary: multi-layer encryption, biometric verification, automated defensive systems that could lock down the entire facility in under 2 seconds. Everyone knew the rules. Trigger one alarm and the whole place would seal itself off. Every military vessel within 6 hours would get an alert. Every intelligence agency would go to full alert status. The station wasn't just secure. It was a statement of power. Drake needed what was inside. Not the hardware. Not the physical space. He needed the raw, unfiltered communication streaming through its core. The real-time conversations between admirals and ministers. The financial transfer authorizations. The unedited situation reports. His crew's objective was simple: get full access, extract everything, leave without a trace. The station's entire design was meant to make this impossible. They moved at exactly 02:47 station time. The operation unfolded across 4 separate entry points simultaneously, a choreography of digital intrusion. Zaraplex handled the main quantum encryption layers, using algorithms Drake himself had designed years earlier for Earth's Security Council. He knew the backdoors because he had built them in. Hidden vulnerabilities, elegant flaws woven into the original code known only to him. They were his insurance policies now activated. Corval managed the physical infrastructure bypass. He isolated the alarm triggers from the main power grid, creating a 97-second window where the station's automated defenses were blind. The Cynthian twins synchronized the data extraction, their minds processing the flood of information, filtering for priority intelligence while maintaining absolute stealth. Not one security camera was looped. Not one motion sensor gave a false reading. The station's own internal logs showed perfect operational status. For 17 minutes, they owned the core of the hegemony's communications network. They didn't plant viruses. They didn't leave sabotage packages. They simply watched. They listened. They collected. They took every secret the station held and copied it into their own secure buffers. Then they withdrew. Every access point was closed. Every system was returned to its original state. The window of vulnerability vanished. The station's crew continued their shifts completely unaware. The security team saw nothing out of the ordinary. The silence was absolute. The first hint of the breach came 3 days later, when a routine data integrity check found minute inconsistencies in timestamp verifications. By then, it was far too late. Drake had everything. The Phantom crew had just demonstrated a new kind of warfare, one where the victor doesn't destroy the fortress. They simply walk through its walls, take what they need, and leave the structure standing. No explosions, no casualties, just perfect, undetectable theft of information. This silent victory gave Drake his first real leverage against the powers that had exiled him. He now held their secrets, and he knew how to use them. Drake recognized data as the ultimate currency of power. Earth's government still measured strength in warships and territorial control. They maintained vast fleets. They garrisoned key systems. They projected force through visible, tangible assets. Their entire concept of influence was built on a foundation of military might and economic pressure. They understood power as something you could see, count, and park in orbit above a rebellious planet. It was an old way of thinking. A blunt instrument. Drake built something entirely different. While Earth constructed dreadnoughts, he constructed databases. His network wasn't a physical thing. It was a web of information, constantly growing, constantly learning. His operatives embedded themselves in the communication hubs of 3 council systems. They didn't wear uniforms or carry weapons. They sat at consoles. They monitored data flows. They became part of the administrative machinery everyone relied on, and nobody truly watched. His primary objective was intelligence gathering on a scale never before attempted. He compiled dossiers on every key official within the Earth hegemony. Not just their public records, their private financial dealings, their hidden relationships, their undisclosed biases and secret compromises. He tracked the movement of capital across sectors, following the money through shell corporations and off-ledger accounts. He knew where the wealth was hidden and who was stealing it. This network operated on a simple principle. Watching provided more advantage than striking. Immediate action would have revealed his hand. It would have triggered a response. A direct confrontation would have been a fight on Earth's terms using Earth's rules. Drake refused to play that game. He allowed the hegemony to continue its operations, all while his systems documented every transaction, every covert meeting, every lie told to the public. Information became his capacity to act. Knowledge became his leverage. He understood the political and economic systems of his enemies better than they understood themselves. He knew which officials were corrupt, which admirals were embezzling funds, which ministers had made secret deals with rival factions. He saw the entire architecture of their power, and he saw every crack in the foundation. His hidden network was a mirror held up to their empire, showing them truths they had worked very hard to forget. The resolution was clear. He had built an intelligence apparatus that could predict the hegemony's moves before their own leadership made them. He could anticipate economic shifts, political maneuvers, and military deployments because he possessed the raw data that fed those decisions. His power was not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to know, to understand, to see the entire board while his opponents were still squinting at their own pieces. This deep systemic intelligence would soon find its first major application. The opportunity emerged not from a military conflict, but from an economic policy announcement. Earth's leadership, confident in their traditional leverage, was about to make a critical error in judgment. They were planning to flex their economic muscles at the upcoming Proxima Trade Summit, a move designed to cement their dominance for the foreseeable future. They didn't realize Drake was already in the room. He had their plans, he had their communications, and he was prepared to offer the galaxy a better deal. Earth's Economic Council made their move at the Proxima Trade Summit. Their plan was simple and brutal. They announced a 70% tariff on all imported quantum computing components. This wasn't just a tax, it was a stranglehold. They controlled the manufacturing patents. They owned the shipping lanes. They held a near-total monopoly on the advanced materials required. This tariff would force every developing system to pay crippling fees for the technology they needed to compete. It was a power play designed to last for generations. Earth's dominance would be absolute, enforced by economic pressure rather than fleets. They thought their position was unassailable. They were wrong. Drake's intelligence network had intercepted the planning sessions weeks earlier. He saw the entire strategy laid out in confidential memos and encrypted directives. He knew the exact arguments their diplomats would use. He knew which systems they planned to pressure first. He had a complete tactical read on their economic offensive. His response was not a protest. It was a counteroffer. As Earth's trade minister finished his speech, a new proposal appeared on every delegate's datapad. It came from an entity no one had heard of before, the Shadow Consortium. The offer was direct. They could provide quantum network systems with twice the processing speed of Earth's best models. They offered them at half the price Earth was charging before the tariffs, and they included full technical support and open architecture licenses. There were no hidden fees, no forced loyalty clauses, no political conditions. The delegation from the Cygnus sector was the first to break ranks. Their economy was entirely dependent on quantum analytics. The new Earth tariffs would have bankrupted them in a standard year. They signed a preliminary agreement with the Shadow Consortium before the summit session had even adjourned. The Proxima delegates followed, then the delegates from the Orion Fringe. One by one, the major systems turned away from Earth's table. The exodus was quiet, professional, and total. Earth's leverage evaporated in less than an hour. Their economic weapon was just made obsolete. Their control was built on scarcity and exclusive access. The Shadow Consortium demonstrated abundance and open cooperation. The trust in Earth's governance shattered. Their reputation as a reliable partner was gone. They were revealed as bullies who could be bypassed. Their entire economic strategy collapsed because someone offered a better, cheaper, and fairer alternative. Drake demonstrated a fundamental truth. Economic power does not belong to those who control the resources. It belongs to those who control the best value. He didn't need to fire a shot. He didn't need to issue a threat. He simply provided a superior product at a superior price. The market did the rest. The Shadow Consortium gained immediate legitimacy and massive contracts. But it remained a phantom. No one knew who controlled it. No one could find its headquarters. It had public credibility and complete deniability. Drake now had a visible vehicle for his influence and absolute privacy for his operations. The gambit was a perfect victory. Drake built 3 organizations. They appeared completely separate. Earth's intelligence analysts tracked them as independent entities. They assessed each as a corporate competitor or a new market force. They never connected them. They never saw the single hand guiding all 3. This was by design. The Nexus Financial Group operated with quiet efficiency. It didn't make headlines. It didn't seek attention. It simply acquired debt. It purchased the outstanding loans of 3 major council systems that were struggling under Earth's economic policies. It didn't use predatory terms. It offered restructuring, fair interest rates, long-term stability. It became the preferred creditor for governments that felt strangled by Earth's financial institutions. Nexus held the economic leash, but it never yanked it. It just held it, calmly. Helio Security emerged as a defense contractor. It started small, providing protection for minor trade routes plagued by piracy. Its methods were effective. Its prices were reasonable. Its contracts were transparent. Within 2 years, it guarded 40% of all major shipping lanes in the outer systems. Its security teams were professional. Its response times were unmatched. Planets and corporations hired Helio because it worked. They didn't realize they were outsourcing their safety to the very man Earth had exiled. Helio controlled the physical flow of commerce and people. The Shadow Consortium was the public face. It was the name everyone knew after the Proxima Summit. It controlled the next-generation quantum comm network that was rapidly replacing Earth's outdated systems. It became the galactic communications backbone. Data flowed through its nodes. Information traveled on its pathways. It didn't monitor the traffic. It just owned the highway. These 3 empires reported to Drake through a labyrinth of intermediaries, cutouts, blind trusts, shell corporations. The chain of command was so fragmented that no external audit could ever trace it back to its source. The CEO of Nexus didn't know the director of Helio. The board of the Shadow Consortium had never met. They all received directives from anonymous sources. They executed strategies they believed were their own. This structure was a direct response to Earth's failure. Earth's hegemony had collapsed because a small group of elites made secret decisions in closed rooms. They abused their power because nobody was watching. Drake's triple empire was designed to prevent that. Each organization had internal oversight. Each had published operational protocols. Their power was distributed. Their operations were visible. The secrecy was only at the very top, in the identity of their commander. The systems themselves were built to resist corruption, economic power, security power, information power. 3 separate pillars, each strong on its own. Together, they were unbreakable. They were fused under a single, coherent strategic vision. Drake didn't just want to own the systems that banished him. He wanted to rebuild them. His endgame was not control for its own sake. It was correction. He was creating a new architecture, one where power could be exercised but never hidden, one where influence was real but always accountable. The structure was now in place. The next phase was about activating its full potential. Journalist Ela Thorne secured the interview through a series of encrypted dead drops. She expected to meet a bitter revolutionary, a man twisted by exile motivated by a need for payback. She prepared to document a story of vengeance. She was wrong. The man who met her was calm, measured. He didn't speak like someone who had been wronged. He spoke like an architect reviewing blueprints. The problem with Earth isn't that it's evil, Drake stated. It's short-sighted. They see power as a finite resource to be hoarded. They use force to protect their position because they can't imagine another way. Their control was always an illusion, a system built on borrowed authority. They never truly owned their power. They just managed it poorly for a while. He explained it wasn't about forgiveness. The past was a set of data points, a series of failures to be analyzed, not grievances to be avenged. The goal was understanding why the system broke, then building a better one. His exile wasn't a personal tragedy. It was a strategic opportunity. It was the one move that gave him the freedom to operate outside every constraint. They stripped him of his citizenship, his identity, his place in their structure. In doing so, they freed him from its rules. His aim was to demonstrate what real vision looked like, not through speeches or manifestos, through function, through building systems that worked so well, they made the old ways obsolete. The Triple Empire was a practical example, a working model of power that was distributed, transparent, and accountable. He wasn't trying to punish the old guard. He was making them irrelevant. Forgiveness would imply the old system was worth returning to. He had no interest in that. The point was to show that a better structure was possible, one where corruption was designed out of the equation, where power couldn't be concentrated in the hands of a few because the architecture itself prevented it. His goal was prevention, not punishment. He wasn't building a courtroom to try the guilty. He was building a government that wouldn't produce them. Thorne left the interview with a completely different story than the one she expected. This wasn't a tale of revenge. It was a case study in systemic overhaul. The man they exiled hadn't spent his years planning their downfall. He had spent them designing their replacement. His philosophy was cold, logical, and utterly compelling. It removed emotion from the equation and focused solely on results. This philosophy was about to move from theory to practice. The architecture was complete. The intelligence was gathered. The leverage was in place. The next step wasn't an attack. It was an activation. A single command that would put his entire design into motion. It was time to show the galaxy what happened when you replaced vengeance with vision, when you stopped trying to fix a broken machine and just built a new one. The silent takeover was about to become very, very loud. Zara Plex entered the final authorization code. The command was simple, a 12-digit sequence. It activated the protocol Drake had embedded years earlier, woven into the core operating systems of every major communication network. It was a dormant line of code, a seed planted in the digital soil of the hegemony. It had been waiting. The command would trigger a data dump of unprecedented scale, flooding every connected device with the complete archive of hidden documents. Earth's security apparatus was designed to prevent exactly this. They had layers of digital fortifications, counter-intrusion systems, kill switches that could sever entire sectors from the network. They had planned for brute force attacks, for hacking attempts, for digital sieges. They never planned for something that was already inside, a command that didn't attack the walls. It simply unlocked a door that had been left open by the original architects. Their own systems would execute the command because it carried legitimate, high-level authorization credentials that Drake had created and never revoked. The broadcast began simultaneously on billions of devices, public screens in city centers, private terminals in government offices, personal communicators in the hands of citizens. The message was identical. A calm, synthesized voice stated, "Attention, all citizens, initiating system transparency protocol." Then the screens changed. They didn't flicker. They didn't crash. They simply opened. Hundreds of data windows materialized on every display, organized and clear. The content was raw and unfiltered. Internal government directives authorizing black budget projects, secret trade agreements that undermined public treaties, financial records showing massive embezzlement from public funds, correspondence between officials detailing plans to suppress dissent and manipulate markets, audio logs of covert meetings, video evidence of staged events. For decades, the truth had been curated, edited, and hidden. Now it was all available. Every lie, every stolen credit, every betrayal. It was laid bare in a simultaneous galaxy-wide release. Citizens on 100 worlds stood frozen, watching their leadership's private dealings become public knowledge. There was no spin, no official statement, just the raw data, presented without comment. The scale was incomprehensible. This was the largest single release of classified information in history. It wasn't stolen by an outsider. It was delivered by the systems people used every day. The very tools of control became the instruments of revelation. Knowledge was instantly democratized. The monopoly on information was broken. The power to shape narratives, to control what people knew, evaporated in a single moment. Accountability was no longer the job of inspectors or investigators. It was in the hands of every citizen who could now see the evidence for themselves. The revelation was not an attack. It was an awakening. The foundation of the old power structure was not just cracked. It was replaced with a new one made of pure, undeniable fact. This sudden, overwhelming truth had immediate consequences. The financial records exposed in the data dump were particularly damning. They showed the movement of stolen wealth. They identified the accounts where illicit funds were hidden. They detailed the schemes used to drain public resources. The transparency protocol didn't just reveal the crimes. It provided the evidence needed to undo them. The truth was now a tangible asset. It was the trigger for the next phase. A financial revolution was now inevitable. The data provided the map. The next step was to follow it. The financial shifts began exactly 37 seconds after the Transparency Protocol finished its broadcast. It wasn't a simple transfer. It was a systemic recalibration. Automated processes, designed and embedded by Drake's team over years of observation, activated across the core banking networks of dozens of worlds. Their algorithms moved with a cold surgical precision. They identified stolen credits, misappropriated assets, and embezzled funds. Then they began the process of return. Earth's Central Banking Authority detected the anomalous activity within minutes. They initiated emergency protocols. They tried to freeze entire sectors. They activated transaction blocks. They issued system-wide alerts. Their responses were textbook. They were also useless. Drake's team had spent years tracking the financial flows. They had created backdoors and bypasses within the very systems now trying to stop them. The freeze commands hit digital walls that didn't exist on any official schematic. The transactions continued, uninterrupted, unstoppable. The scale was galactic. On a mining colony in the belt, a community fund drained by a corrupt administrator suddenly refilled. The balance was restored. Then it grew. The algorithm added compound interest calculated from the day the theft occurred. On a core world, a university's research endowment secretly funneled into a political slush fund reappeared in its accounts. The amount was larger than before. The interest was a penalty, a financial consequence for the time the money was gone. This was not theft. It was restoration. The movement of wealth was not a raid on treasury reserves. It was the return of stolen property to its rightful owners. The process was automated, impartial, and brutally efficient. It corrected imbalance. It settled accounts. Economic power, once concentrated in the hands of the few who knew how to game the system, began to shift. It flowed back to the citizens, the organizations, the communities that had been exploited. The velocity of the change was its own shock. Justice was not slow. It was computational. It occurred at the speed of data. The impact was immediate and profound. The old elites watched their hidden assets vanish from shielded accounts. Their illegal gains were identified, seized, and rerouted. There were no pleading messages, no ransom demands, just the silent, inexorable reclamation of what was never theirs to hold. For the victims, the experience was equally jarring. Notifications appeared on personal devices. Accounts they had thought empty were full. Funds they had written off as lost were returned with interest. The event was a quiet, widespread economic earthquake. This massive redistribution of wealth destabilized the foundation of the old power structure. Their control had always relied on financial leverage, on the ability to grant or deny resources. That tool was now broken. The playing field was not just leveled, it was entirely recalibrated. The financial correction was a silent partner to the information revelation. One provided the truth, the other provided the means to act on it. The combination was devastating to the status quo. As this quiet revolution unfolded across banking networks, a more personal confrontation was beginning. The architect of this systemic overhaul was not content to remain a phantom. He had one final conversation to have. The most powerful man in the Earth hegemony was about to receive a visitor, not in person, not through agents, but through a direct, uncompromising link. The financial reckoning was complete. Now came the personal one. Chancellor Rovik was in his private dining room. The table was set for one. Fine china, crystal glass. He had just lifted his fork when the air 3 feet from his table shimmered. A holographic form resolved into perfect clarity. Victor Drake stood there looking exactly as he had the day they sentenced him. The same calm eyes. The same measured posture. Rovik froze. His fork hovered midair. The most powerful man in the Earth hegemony was having dinner, and then he was having a visitor. "Hello, Chancellor," Drake said. His voice was clear, devoid of static. "It's been a long time." The statement hung in the air. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. A starting point. Rovik slowly set his fork down. He didn't call for security. He knew it was pointless. If Drake could project a stable hologram into his most secure residence, then all the alarms were already irrelevant. This was not an intrusion. It was a statement of capability. "You exiled me from humanity," Drake stated. It was a simple fact. So I built something better. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was reporting. His tone framed everything that had happened not as revenge but as consequence. A direct and logical outcome of their choices. They had created the conditions for his response. They had provided the motivation. They had defined the problem. He had simply engineered the solution. The confrontation was not private. Drake's holographic feed was being broadcast live across the same networks that had just days before carried the transparency protocol. Every citizen could see the Chancellor sitting at his ornate table, facing the man he had cast out. The broadcast became a live indictment. Drake didn't need to list the charges. The evidence had already been provided. He was just providing the context. The face of the man responsible, he offered a path forward. It wasn't a surrender document. It was a proposal for a new beginning. He explained that the old guard would be held accountable. Their crimes would be investigated. Their stolen wealth would remain reclaimed. But he offered them a choice. They could cling to the broken system and face the full weight of the law. Or they could join the effort to build something new. They could contribute to a structure designed to prevent the very corruption they had practiced. This was the final reframing. Personal exile was no longer a punishment. It was the doorway. It was the necessary removal that allowed for a new social contract to be written. Drake wasn't there to gloat. He was there to offer terms. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Then the hologram faded. Drake was gone. The Chancellor was left alone at his table, his meal growing cold, his authority utterly dissolved in the gaze of the entire galaxy. The system's response to this direct challenge was not long in coming. It was immediate, and it was decisive. Earth's own security forces arrested Chancellor Rovik. The transparency protocol left them no choice. Their own leadership's corruption was laid bare in high definition across every screen. The evidence was specific. It named names. It showed transactions. It played audio logs. The security personnel faced a direct conflict. Their loyalty oaths were to the office. Their duty was to the law. The evidence made it clear the two were no longer the same thing. The arrest teams moved with calm precision. They entered the Chancellor's residence not as invaders but as officials performing a grim, necessary task. The same personal guards who had protected Rovik for years were the ones who detained him. They did it professionally. They read the charges. They secured the subject. There was no struggle, no grandstanding. The process was quiet and inevitable. It felt less like a coup and more like the closing of a case file. Other council members were detained simultaneously across the capital. Their aides, their advisors. The network of complicity was large, but the arrests were surgical. The security forces used the evidence Drake provided as their operational guide. They knew exactly who to pick up and where to find them. The entire upper tier of the Earth hegemony was brought into custody in under 2 hours. The operation was a model of efficiency, a perfect execution of lawful procedure. Interim governments began forming within hours. Mid-level administrators, previously ignored or sidelined, stepped forward. They were the people who actually understood how the bureaucracy functioned. They set up provisional command centers. They issued statements assuring continuity of basic services. The transition was not a power vacuum. It was a controlled handover to the next level of competent and crucially uncompromised officials. Investigations commenced immediately. They didn't start from scratch. They started with the mountain of evidence the transparency protocol had provided. Auditors began tracing funds. Internal affairs units reviewed policy decisions. The work was evidence-based and methodical. The purpose was not to punish indiscriminately, but to adjudicate fairly. Corruption trials would follow. They would be public. They would be based on hard data. But they would not be violent. This was the system policing itself. The resolution was clear. The very enforcers of the old order became the instruments of its accountability. They turned on their former commanders not out of disloyalty, but out of a higher duty to the truth. They demonstrated that the system could correct its own catastrophic errors when presented with undeniable facts. It was a powerful, sobering lesson in institutional self-preservation. The guard had changed, but the building remained standing. The public response to this quiet, methodical takeover of power was about to reveal a surprising truth about the galaxy's citizens. Public demonstrations erupted across dozens of worlds. But these were not protests. They were celebrations. Citizens gathered in central plazas and town squares, not with weapons or anger, but with families. Children played near public fountains. Neighbors spoke to each other openly. The mood was not one of rebellion. It was one of hopeful transition. Conventional wisdom had predicted chaos, retaliation, violent upheaval against the leaders who had deceived them for decades. That did not happen. The people were not there to burn buildings. They were there to mark a change. They celebrated the return of stolen wealth to community accounts. They celebrated the truth finally being revealed after years of official lies. The scale was massive. Millions of people across different systems, all engaging in the same peaceful gathering. They shared the evidence they had seen on their screens. They discussed what it meant for their future. This was a popular reception of revelation, an embrace of transparency. The air was filled with conversation, not chanting. The energy was positive. There was a sense of collective relief. The weight of systemic deception had been lifted. People were not demanding answers. They already had them. The demonstrations were an organic response to that new reality. They were claiming public spaces not to defy authority, but to experience a newfound freedom from it. The old rulers were gone. The truth was out. The money was returned. There was nothing left to fight against, only a future to build. This outcome defied every historical precedent. Revolutions usually involve bloodshed. Power transitions typically create vacuums filled by violence. Here, the opposite occurred. The removal of a corrupt regime was met with widespread public approval and calm. The system's collapse did not trigger a crisis. It triggered a correction. The citizens themselves became the stabilizing force. They enforced the new reality simply by accepting it. The resolution was clear. Transparency had not caused destruction. It had prevented it. By revealing the full extent of the corruption, Drake had removed the need for violent purges. There were no shadowy enemies to hunt, no hidden conspiracies to fear. Everything was out in the open. The truth was so comprehensive, so undeniable, that it produced consensus instead of conflict. The public's response was the final validation of his method. They chose order over chaos. They chose to build rather than destroy. Meanwhile, the organizations Drake had created continued to operate, but they now did so under a new set of rules. Their purpose had shifted from covert acquisition to open service. The transition in the streets was mirrored by a transition in the boardrooms. The tools of the takeover were becoming the instruments of the new governance. The celebration in the squares was just the visible expression of a deeper, systemic shift already underway. The companies that had helped dismantle the old power structure were now central to building the new one. Their operations were about to become completely transparent, setting a new standard for how power could be held accountable. Drake explained Exile's unexpected gift. He did not see it as a punishment. He saw it as a strategic opportunity most people would never recognize. Earth's government believed they were removing a threat. They were actually removing his limitations. They stripped him of his title, his home, his identity within their system. In doing so, they gave him the one thing he truly needed: freedom. Not the gentle kind, the dangerous kind. Earth didn't banish me 17 years ago. They unleashed me. This wasn't a boast. It was a tactical assessment. Conventional wisdom frames exile as a failure, a personal and political endpoint, a casting out. Drake reframed it. It was the ultimate liberation from a stifling, unimaginative structure. They thought they were containing his influence. They were actually setting it loose upon the entire galaxy, free from their narrow rules and bureaucratic inertia. He lost his home, his standing, his place in the order of things. That loss created a vacuum, a blank slate. Most would see only the emptiness. Drake saw the potential. It was the freedom to rebuild from the ground up. No legacy systems to maintain. No outdated traditions to respect. No committees to appease. He could design everything from first principles. His only constraints were physics and his own imagination. That is a terrifying amount of liberty for a strategic mind. Earth's short-sightedness became the galaxy's salvation. Their attempt to neutralize a perceived threat actually created the conditions for their own replacement. Their punishment became the catalyst for a transformation they could never have engineered themselves. They were too invested in preserving the old model. They were trapped by their own power. Drake, by being ejected, was granted the perspective and the freedom to see a better way. Exile taught a brutal but essential lesson. True power does not come from a title or a position within an existing hierarchy. Those are just permissions granted by a system. Real power comes from vision, from the ability to conceive of a new structure and the will to build it. A position can be taken away. A title can be stripped. A vision, once realized, becomes its own authority. It creates its own power base. Banishment became his platform for unprecedented reinvention. He was not trying to reclaim his old life. He was not seeking to re-enter their system through a different door. He used the clean break they forced upon him to construct something entirely new. The old Victor Drake, the one they knew, effectively died the moment the airlock closed behind him. The man who emerged on Omega 12 was someone else, a strategist unbound, an architect with a blank canvas. His identity was no longer given to him by Earth. It was built by him, for his own purposes. The final assessment of his journey puts everything into a new perspective. His story is not a simple reversal of fortune. It is not about the exiled becoming the ruler. It is about the fundamental nature of power itself. It demonstrates that influence is not a finite resource to be seized, but a structure to be designed. Control is not about holding a position at the top of a pyramid. It is about designing the foundation upon which the next pyramid will be built. His exile was not the end of his story. It was the necessary beginning of a much larger one. The narrative reached its conclusion. Exiled from Earth, he returned humanity to the galaxy. This was the core of the story. One man's journey did change galactic civilization. Not through force of arms, not through charismatic leadership, through systemic correction. Drake was not a conqueror. He was a catalyst. His actions did not create a new empire. They dismantled an old one and replaced it with something more resilient. He disarmed an oppressive system through information. He understood that knowledge was the real weapon. Control of data meant control of reality. He used that understanding to expose decades of deception. He revealed the truth to every citizen simultaneously. He gave people the facts they needed to make their own judgments. This was not a propaganda campaign, it was a revelation. The public response was not anger. It was a collective decision to move forward. Ordinary citizens now shape their future with full transparency. They have access to the same information their leaders do. They can track government spending in real time. They can review security policy drafts. They can monitor corporate transactions. The system is designed for participation, not obedience. Power flows from informed consent, not from concealed force. This is the return of humanity to governance. It is the restoration of agency to the individual. The story reframes exile. It is no longer a punishment. It is a genesis, a beginning. The act of banishment removed Drake from a corrupt structure. It freed him to build a better one. His journey demonstrates that sometimes rejection is the necessary precondition for creation. Being cast out allowed him to see the flaws in the system clearly. It gave him the distance required to design a true alternative. The assessment felt earned. This was the story of the century, not because of its scale or its drama, because of its outcome. It showed that systemic change is possible without widespread violence. It proved that information can be more powerful than fleets. It demonstrated that a single determined individual, operating from the margins, can alter the course of history if they understand the underlying systems better than those in charge. The exiled innovator became the engine of a just and resilient order. His personal grievance was transformed into a galactic solution. He took the experience of being wronged and used it to prevent others from suffering the same fate. He designed a system where the mechanisms of power could not be easily corrupted, where transparency was built into the foundation, where accountability was automatic. His creation is not a utopia. It is a practical, functioning government that learns from the failures of the past. The implications of this transformation stretch far beyond one man's journey. They challenge our basic assumptions about power and punishment. They suggest that exile, often seen as an endpoint, can be a starting point. They show that the most effective revolutions are not always loud and violent. Sometimes they are quiet and surgical. They operate in the realm of ideas and systems, not in the streets. The real change happens when you alter the rules of the game itself, not just the players. This story is not about a hero's return. It is about a system's redesign. The lesson is clear. True power lies not in occupying a position within an existing structure, but in understanding that structure well enough to build a better one. The most dangerous person is not the one who wants to rule the world. It is the one who wants to rebuild it. And sometimes, the best way to start that rebuilding is to be pushed out of the old world entirely. The view from the outside provides the clarity needed to see what must be done. Drake's strategy offered lessons for power structures everywhere. The first lesson is clear. Information outweighs violence for sustained influence. Earth's hegemony relied on fleets and garrisons. They projected force. They controlled territory. They believed visible power was real power. Drake demonstrated that data is the true currency of control. He didn't need to destroy their warships. He just needed to understand their communications better than they did. He gathered intelligence on their leaders. He tracked their financial flows. He operated in the spaces they weren't watching. This approach proved more effective and lasting than any military campaign. His power grew in the shadows while theirs diminished in the spotlight. Traditional power dismisses intelligence as secondary to force. It views data as a tool for operations, not the operation itself. This is a critical error. Watching provides more advantage than striking prematurely. Immediate action reveals your position. It triggers a response. It forces you to fight on your enemy's terms. Drake's patience was a weapon. He observed for years. He built his network. He gathered his evidence. He waited for the perfect moment to act. This allowed him to control the timing and the terms of every engagement. He never reacted. He always initiated. Leverage comes from understanding systems better than their creators. Drake designed Earth's quantum communication networks. He knew their flaws because he put them there. He understood the architecture intimately. This deep knowledge allowed him to bypass security, to manipulate data flows, to turn their own technology against them. He didn't attack the system from the outside. He subverted it from within. He knew it better than the people using it. This principle applies to any structure. To defeat a system, you must first comprehend it completely. Transparency prevents corruption more effectively than punishment. Harsh penalties for wrongdoing are reactive. They occur after the damage is done. Making operations visible is proactive. It stops the abuse before it starts. Drake's transparency protocol didn't just punish corrupt officials. It created an environment where corruption was nearly impossible to hide. It engineered accountability into the daily function of governance. This architectural approach to integrity is far more resilient than any set of laws or punishments. It makes good behavior the default, not the exception. Exile can create opportunity where punishment was intended. Being cast out is typically seen as an end. A failure. Drake reframed it as a beginning. It removed him from a broken system. It gave him the freedom to design a new one without any legacy constraints. His banishment was not a setback. It was a strategic advantage. It provided the clean slate necessary for true innovation. This turns conventional wisdom on its head. Sometimes the greatest limitation is being trapped inside the system you want to change. True power builds alternatives rather than destroying enemies. Vengeance is a finite goal. It focuses on the past. Construction is an infinite game. It focuses on the future. Drake didn't just tear down Earth's hegemony. He built the Nexus Financial Group. He created Helio Security. He established the Shadow Consortium. He provided better services, fairer deals, more secure protection. He made the old system obsolete by offering a superior replacement. This is the most durable form of power. It doesn't defeat the competition. It replaces it. Systemic change requires architectural thinking, not emotional reaction. Anger and resentment are fuels. They can start a fire, but they cannot design a new city. Drake's entire operation was based on cold, logical analysis of systems and incentives. He designed solutions. He engineered outcomes. He removed his personal grievances from the equation and focused solely on building a better structure. This detached analytical approach is what allowed him to succeed where others would have failed. He was an architect first, a revolutionary second. These principles now shaped a new galactic era. They became the foundation of a government designed for resilience and accountability. The lessons learned from one man's exile were being applied across dozens of worlds. The focus shifted from controlling people to designing systems that serve them, from hiding information to distributing it widely, from punishing wrongdoing to preventing it through transparency. This was not a perfect utopia. It was a practical, functioning model built on a better understanding of how power truly works. The structure of the entire hegemony changed. It transformed into something entirely new, a system of governance no one had ever seen before. Dozens of worlds, each adjusting at their own pace, began operating under these new transparent systems. The shift was radical, a complete inversion of centuries of political tradition. Many observers, both inside and outside the former power structure, doubted such a fundamental change could stabilize quickly. They predicted power vacuums. They forecasted fragmentation and civil war. They expected the sudden removal of central authority to create a dozen smaller, competing empires. That is not what happened. Interim governments formed from mid-level bureaucrats and local officials. They were the administrators who actually knew how things worked. They kept the lights on. They maintained supply lines. They ensured public services continued without interruption. Their leadership was pragmatic, not ideological. They focused on function, not power. To everyone's surprise, these provisional administrations proved effective. More importantly, they were popular. The public supported them because they were competent and, crucially, visibly honest. They were a temporary solution that people trusted. The corruption trials began. They proceeded with a calm, methodical pace. There were no dramatic courtroom outbursts, no claims of innocence. The evidence against the old leadership was too overwhelming. The data Drake released was specific, verifiable, and impossible to deny. The trials were a formality, a public recording of facts everyone already knew. The justice was not vengeful. It was procedural. It was the system formally acknowledging its own past failures and officially moving to correct them. The wealth redistribution continued. The automatic return of stolen assets to citizens and communities did not cause economic chaos, as many economists had feared. It had the opposite effect. It increased stability, putting capital back into the hands of the people who would actually spend it and invest it locally, stimulated growth. It corrected generations of imbalance. The economy did not collapse. It began to thrive on a broader, more equitable foundation. Economic power was no longer a weapon for the few. It was a tool for the many. Drake's companies, now under full public oversight, set the new standard for corporate governance. Nexus Financial published every transaction. Helio Security answered to elected civilian boards. The Shadow Consortium's technology became open source. They operated with a level of transparency that was previously unthinkable for organizations of their size and influence. They became the model. Other corporations were forced to follow suit to maintain public trust and compete. The very entities that had executed the quiet takeover were now the pillars of the new open system. The galaxy did not enter a period of rebellion or violent upheaval. It entered a sustained period of reform. The energy that, in another time, might have fueled civil war was instead channeled into rebuilding institutions. There was a collective sense of purpose, a shared project of creating something better from the broken pieces of the old order. The resolution was clear. The act of exile, intended to neutralize a threat, had ultimately produced a form of governance that was more resilient and more accountable than anything that had existed before. The final meaning of this entire story was about to come into sharp, undeniable focus. The story reframed banishment itself. Exile became a genesis rather than an endpoint. They stripped Victor Drake of everything they thought defined him: his title, his citizenship, his place in their rigid order. They intended it as a final punctuation mark on his life. Instead, they wrote the opening sentence of a much larger story. Conventional wisdom has always viewed exile as the ultimate personal and political failure. A casting out, a permanent erasure from the narrative of power. Drake demonstrated it was something else entirely. A strategic opportunity of the highest order. His forced departure enabled an unparalleled return. But he did not return to the old world. He did not seek to reclaim his former position or status. That would have meant accepting their rules. their definitions of success and failure. Instead, he redefined the world itself. He built a new structure from the ground up, one that made their entire system obsolete. The hero's journey is traditionally about leaving home, gaining power, and returning to restore order. Drake's journey reversed that. He was ejected. He gained a deeper, more fundamental power through that rejection, and he returned not to restore the old order, but to replace it entirely. His transformation occurred through rejection, not acceptance. The system cast him out because it could not tolerate his vision. It could not accommodate his understanding of how power truly flows. That act of expulsion was the catalyst. It was the necessary break that freed him from all constraints. He was no longer bound by their laws, their politics, or their limited imagination. He could operate with a clarity and purpose that those inside the system could never achieve. They were too busy maintaining their positions. He was free to focus solely on building a better foundation. Adversity became his platform for unprecedented growth and systemic overhaul. The hardship of exile was real. The isolation, the initial struggle for survival on Omega 12. But he used every bit of that pressure. He transformed it into fuel. The experience didn't harden him with bitterness. It sharpened him with focus. It provided the necessary friction to grind away everything non-essential, leaving only a pure, undiluted strategic intent. His personal journey of overcoming became the blueprint for a galactic-scale correction. He took the lesson of his own resilience and applied it to an entire civilization. The final assessment places Drake in a stark historical context. He is not a conqueror who seized a throne. He is an architect who designed a new city. His legacy is not a list of battles won, but a set of principles enacted. He proved that the most effective way to change a system is not to fight it on its own terms, but to understand it so completely that you can build a better alternative beside it. His story redefines what it means to be an outcast. It shows that being pushed to the margins doesn't mean you're out of the game. It means you have a better view of the entire board. And sometimes that is the greatest advantage anyone can have. Drake's legacy wasn't empire. It was accountability. His name became synonymous with a new kind of power, one that operated in the open. The Shadow Consortium was no longer a mysterious organization. It became the symbol of this transparent authority. Many citizens and analysts still feared concentrated power. They worried that any centralized control, even under new management, could eventually corrupt. They had seen it happen before. Their skepticism was healthy. It was a sign the galaxy had learned from its past. But the architecture Drake designed prevented the abuses of previous systems. The structure itself enforced integrity. Information was no longer a weapon to be wielded in private. It flowed publicly. Government communications, financial transactions, security logs, all were accessible to anyone. The old system hoarded knowledge to maintain control. The new system distributed it to maintain trust. Secrecy was treated as a systemic vulnerability, not a tool of state. Economic power was redirected. It now served the public good rather than private interests. The automatic wealth redistribution wasn't a one-time event. It established a new principle. Capital was monitored for fraud and manipulation in real time. Stolen assets were continuously identified and returned. The financial infrastructure was rebuilt to favor broad participation over elite accumulation. Profit was not outlawed, but exploitation was engineered out of the system. Security underwent the same transformation. Protection services answered to civilian boards. Their mandate was clear. Protect citizens, not elites. Guard trade routes for the benefit of all merchants, not just the powerful corporations. The use of force was always a last resort, and every deployment was a matter of public record. There were no black operations, no deniable assets. Security became a visible service, not a hidden threat. The system's core design ensured it would resist future corruption. Automated audits ran constantly. Compliance was non-negotiable and fully transparent. The architecture made hiding unethical actions more difficult than performing them. The goal was to make integrity the easiest path. To build a government where doing the right thing required no extraordinary effort, where corruption was a high-risk, low-reward endeavor. This was a permanent fix, not a temporary solution. The resolution was absolute. One man's exile created the most transparent government in galactic history. He was cast out for being a visionary, and that expulsion gave him the freedom to turn his vision into reality. He didn't just defeat the old power structure. he made its return impossible. He built a system that learned from its own history, a government designed to correct its own errors before they could become catastrophes. The structure itself is his lasting monument. The story's ultimate meaning now became clear. It demonstrates that the most profound change doesn't always come from loud revolutions or violent overthrows. Sometimes it comes from a quiet, surgical redesign of the rules themselves. It proves that power can be exercised responsibly if the system is built to demand it. The galaxy learned that a single individual, armed with the right principles and a clear vision, can alter the destiny of civilizations. The final lesson is one of hope. It shows that even the deepest injustice can become the catalyst for a more just and durable order. Exile taught the galaxy its most dangerous truth. When you strip someone of everything, their home, their identity, their place in society, they become free to build anything. There is nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Victor Drake's story proves that true power does not come from controlling the old system. It comes from building a better one. Remember this. Sometimes the greatest punishment imaginable becomes the galaxy's greatest, most unforeseen blessing. Forced departure can grant the clarity and freedom necessary to reconstruct everything from the ground up, only stronger.